Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story where happiness finally arrives after countless storms. But is it really the ending or just the beginning of something more dangerous? What happens when a long-awaited proposal brings love to its peak, but also awakens a powerful force that refuses to let go? Will this be their happily ever after or the start of a new battle? Stay with me to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Time passed more quietly than anyone had expected. After all the chaos, the confrontations, the sleepless nights and difficult choices, life, little by little, began to fall into place. At the company, things were changing rapidly. Under the leadership of the CEO, the business was growing stronger than ever. Decisions were sharper, direction clearer, and for the first time he wasn't leading under pressure or expectation. He was leading with purpose. There was something different about him now, not colder, not harder, just steadier. But if anyone had asked him what mattered most, he wouldn't have talked about contracts, growth, or expansion. He would have talked about home, because every night, no matter how long the day had been, no matter how heavy the work felt, he always returned to the same place, the apartment, the light in the living room, and Tieu Lac. That evening, like many others, the CEO stepped into the apartment quietly. He loosened his tie, his shoulders still carrying the fatigue of a long day. But the moment he saw the scene in front of him, something inside him softened instantly. Xiao Lac was sitting on the floor, gently playing with their daughter. The baby was no longer the tiny, fragile little girl he remembered. She had grown. Her laughter filled the room, pure, light, untouched by everything they had been through. Xiao Lac looked up, noticing him at the door. "You're home," she said softly, a warm smile spreading across her face. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there for a moment, watching them, as if trying to hold on to that exact moment forever. Then he stepped forward. "I'm home," he said quietly. Life hadn't become perfect, but it had become real, and that was enough. Over the months, Xiao Lac had changed too. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, quiet ways. She had learned how to balance everything, being a mother, being a partner, being herself. There were still moments when she felt unsure, when old fears crept back in, when memories of the past brushed against her thoughts. But now she didn't face them alone, and that made all the difference. Mornings in their apartment were simple, sometimes chaotic, sometimes peaceful, but always filled with life. The sound of the baby crying for milk, the soft footsteps across the floor, the quiet conversations over breakfast. The CEO, once always rushing, now sometimes paused, just to watch, just to be there. One morning, as Xiao Lac stood in the kitchen preparing a simple meal, the CEO leaned against the wall, arms crossed, quietly observing her. "You've changed," he said suddenly. She turned, slightly surprised. "Changed?" He nodded. "You're stronger now." Xiao Lac smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I had to be." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. That night, after putting the baby to sleep, they sat together in the living room. No rush, no pressure. Just the quiet comfort of being beside each other. The CEO glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Are you happy?" he asked. It wasn't a casual question, it carried weight. Xiao Lac looked at him for a moment, then answered honestly. "I am," she said. Then after a pause, she added softly, "Even after everything, I still am." He nodded slowly, but deep down, something stirred inside him, because he knew. What they had now was something they had fought for, and maybe something he had never truly given her properly. Days passed, and then one evening, something felt different. Xiao Lac noticed it first. The apartment was unusually quiet, too quiet. No familiar sounds, no small movements, no soft interruptions. She stepped inside slowly. "Hello?" she called out. No answer. Her heart skipped slightly. Then, the lights dimmed. A soft glow filled the room. Candles, everywhere, carefully placed, warm, gentle, unexpected. Tieu Lac froze, her breath caught in her chest. "What is this?" she whispered. Then she saw him, standing in the center of the room. The CEO, not in his usual composed, controlled state, but indifferent, nervous. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, each moment heavy with meaning. "Tieu Lac," he said quietly. She looked at him, eyes wide, still trying to process everything. He took a deep breath. "I realized something," he continued. "After everything we've been through, I never really gave you this moment." Her heart started to race. "You stood by me when everything was falling apart," he said. "You stayed when it would have been easier to leave. You built a family with me, without ever asking for anything in return." His voice softened. "But I should have." He reached into his pocket and slowly knelt down. Time seemed to stop. Tieu Lac's eyes filled with tears instantly, not from sadness, but from something deeper, something she had never expected to feel like this. "This is not just a promise," he said. "This is a choice that I make again, every day." He opened the ring box. "I love you, Tieu Lac." A pause, just one breath. "Will you marry me?" Silence, but not empty. Full, heavy, beautiful. Tears rolled down Tieu Lac's cheeks. She covered her mouth, trying to steady herself. For a moment she couldn't speak, because this wasn't just a proposal. It was everything they had been through. Every sacrifice, every pain, every moment that led them here. She nodded, then whispered, "Yes." The CEO stood up and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear, as if everything could still slip away. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not the battles, not the fears. Just them. And the life they had built together. But somewhere deep beneath the surface, a quiet question remained. Was this truly the beginning of their forever? Or just the calm before another storm? The moment lingered longer than either of them expected. Tieu Lac was still standing there, her hand gently resting in his, the ring now on her finger catching the soft glow of candlelight. Everything felt unreal, not in a distant way, but in the kind of quiet disbelief that comes when something you never dared to expect finally happens. She looked down at the ring again, then back up at him. "You really planned all this?" she asked, her voice still slightly trembling. The CEO let out a soft breath, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "Not all at once," he admitted. "But I've been thinking about it for a long time." "A long time," she echoed, half laughing through her tears. He nodded. "Since the moment I realized I didn't want to lose you, not under any circumstances." There was no grand declaration in his tone, no dramatic emphasis, just truth. Tieu Lac stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him again, this time tighter. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because she finally felt something settle inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was holding on to something fragile. She felt safe. That night, neither of them slept right away. They lay side by side, the room now dark, the candles long extinguished, but the warmth still there. "Do you regret anything?" Tieu Lac asked suddenly, her voice quiet in the stillness. The CEO turned his head slightly, looking at her in the dim light. "Regret?" She nodded. "All of it. The fights, your family, everything we had to go through. If you could go back, would you choose differently?" There was a long pause, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to answer it right. "No," he said finally, simple, certain. Not even a little. He shook his head slowly. Because if I changed even one thing, I might not be here. With you. With our daughter. He reached over, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. And this is the only outcome I ever wanted. Tieu Lac didn't respond, but her fingers tightened slightly around his. That was enough. The next morning felt different. Not dramatically, but subtly, like something invisible had shifted. The air was lighter. The small routines felt warmer. Even the baby seemed unusually cheerful, her laughter echoing more often through the apartment. Xiao Lac stood in front of the mirror, absent-mindedly touching the ring on her finger. She still couldn't quite believe it. After everything, they had made it here, but life, as they both knew by now, didn't pause for happiness. It only watched, waited. Later that day, the CEO returned to work, his expression composed as always. Meetings, reports, decisions, everything moved forward like nothing had changed. But something had. Because this time, every decision he made carried a different weight, not just for himself, but for a future he had just promised. As he stepped into his office, his assistant hesitated slightly before speaking. "Sir, your mother called earlier." The CEO paused, just for a second. "What did she say?" "She didn't say much. Just asked when you'd be available to meet." He nodded slowly. "I'll call her later." But deep down, he already knew this wasn't just a casual meeting. She had been quiet for too long. That evening, back at the apartment, Tieu Lac noticed the change immediately. "You're thinking about something," she said, placing a cup of tea in front of him. The CEO didn't deny it. "My mother," he said simply. Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "She knows?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I think she's known for a while." A brief silence followed. "Are you going to tell her?" Xiao Lac asked. He looked at her, then at the ring on her finger. "I don't think I have to," he replied. "She'll see it." The next day came faster than expected. The CEO stood in front of the large doors leading into his mother's private office. He adjusted his sleeve slightly. A small bruise was still visible near his jaw, a reminder of everything he had been through, and everything he was still walking into. He didn't hide it. He didn't try to cover it. Because this time, he wasn't here to explain. Inside, his mother sat exactly as he remembered. Elegant, composed, unreadable. But her eyes, they missed nothing. She looked at him once, then again. Her gaze paused, just slightly, on his face, on the faint bruise, on the tiredness he couldn't completely hide. And then, her eyes dropped to his hand, the ring. A silence filled the room, not loud, but heavy, deliberate. "You've been busy," she said at last, her tone calm, too calm. The CEO stepped forward. "I have." She leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the table. "Handling things your own way," she continued. Not a question, a statement. He didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to justify anything. Her eyes lifted again, meeting his directly. "And now," she added softly, "you've made it official." A slight pause, just enough to let the weight of it settle. The CEO took a slow breath. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time, more dangerous. Then, very quietly, his mother smiled. But it wasn't warmth. It was something else, something calculated. "If that's the case," she said, her voice almost gentle, "then I suppose we need to talk about what happens next." The CEO's expression didn't change, but inside, he knew. This wasn't over, not even close, because this time, it wasn't just about love or approval. It was about control and whether he was truly ready to walk away from it forever. And somewhere, far from that room, In the quiet warmth of the apartment, Tieu Lac stood by the window, her hand resting gently over the ring, a small smile on her lips, unaware that the next storm had already begun to form. In this episode, after overcoming countless challenges, the CEO and Tieu Lac finally find a moment of peace and happiness in their small family. As their child grows and their life becomes more stable, the CEO surprises Tieu Lac with a heartfelt proposal at their apartment, marking a new beginning for their love. Overwhelmed with emotion, she accepts, believing they have reached their happy ending. However, beneath this joyful moment, tension still lingers. The CEO's powerful mother has already sensed everything, and a new confrontation is inevitable. As the CEO prepares to face her, the question remains: will their love be strong enough to withstand what comes next? Or is this happiness only temporary,